Welcome to another exciting PowerPoint presentation by your favorite public speaker, Ronald J. Brown, although most people just simply call me Ron Brown. What I'm going to be talking to you today about is the history of Harlem. I teach New York history, American history at Toro College, and have been teaching there for many years. Well, when I moved to New York first in the early 90s, I became a licensed New York City tour guide, and like every other place I've lived in my life, I threw myself into the city. Now, I've lived around the world. I lived 5 years in Jerusalem, 5 years in Boston, 7 years in Geneva, Switzerland, a year in Moscow, a year in Budapest, and have been all over the world. Well, when I got to New York, once again, I was fascinated by the city. And on the right, you can see one of my first books, Into the Soul of African American Harlem, a spiritual walking tour. Well, I went around Harlem with my camera and taking hundreds, thousands of pictures of Harlem as it was in the early 1990s. Well, even then, Harlem was changing and changing very rapidly. It was a city within a city that had originally, as we're going to see in this video today, began as a nice upper-class white neighborhood, grew, flourished in the mid-1800s. But then by the late 1800s and early 1900s, it had become a predominantly African-American community, once again filled with African-American restaurants, clubs, churches, bars, apartment houses, stores, you name it. Well, Harlem is now again changing. It is now, as I'm speaking now in the year 2020, it already has a majority population of white people. And so many of the pictures I took back in the early 1990s no longer exist. These are these little mom and pop African-American owned stores, churches, storefront chapels, and Harlem is once again going through another transition. Now, this is very much like every city in the United States and every neighborhood in New York. You go to the Lower East Side, well, you see remnants of the age when it was a flourishing English and Scottish Protestant neighborhood. Then it became predominantly Irish and was filled with churches and schools and clubs and restaurants. Then by the late 1800s, it was predominantly Eastern European Jewish. Well, you go down there today and you see it's all Chinese and Hispanic. Well, what I'm going to do today is sort of compare and contrast all these smaller places in African American Harlem which are being destroyed. Very often I will juxtapose a picture, one I took back in the early 1990s and what is there today. As the African American population drops, as more and more well-to-do white people move in, the neighborhood is changing. One little chapel, African-American, spiritualist chapel of some kind. I go back today and I find it's a hole in the ground or it's been replaced by a skyscraper. A little store that was African-American owned is now replaced by a big chain store. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the history of Harlem and its transition from an African-American ethnic neighborhood to another white neighborhood, and how this is being chronicled through the demolition of buildings, building of new ones. It's an inevitable process. As much as we may lament it, this is what is happening in Harlem. And so we have to deal with it. So let's get started on our program. Well, the very first part of Harlem goes back to Harlem when it was a little Dutch outpost. And here we see on the left New Amsterdam, which is founded by the Dutch, and it was a slave-holding town. Peter Stuyvesant, famous governor, brought over the first shipment of African slaves. They're the ones who, it is claimed, built the wall. If you look at the picture on the left, you see the wall going across the middle of Manhattan. Well, today that is Wall Street. And so that was an item built by the slaves. The big street going from the top of the picture down to the bottom where you see Fort Amsterdam, that is today's Broadway. Well, New Amsterdam was a Dutch town, had a very small population. On the right, we see, looks to me a rather fuzzy map, but we'll have to deal with it. This shows the Dutch land claim. The yellow part and the green part were claimed by Holland. Now, that includes what is today Connecticut, Rhode Island, half of Massachusetts, up to the St. Lawrence River in the north, all of upstate New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that little green tail down at the bottom, that is the state of Delaware today. The pink area on the right and Long Island was claimed by the English. These were our Puritans. Long Island was a battleground. Who was going to control it, the Dutch or the English? And down in the bottom left corner is Virginia. And so this was the little Dutch settlement, a couple thousand people, built in 1624 as the capital for this huge area. But it was already a slave-holding city because very few Dutch or Europeans wanted to migrate to the new colony. And most of the people who did were either soldiers who were forced to come here, or a guy running away from a wife and 10 kids, or one guy ahead of the police, or a girl thought with all these men around she could make a good living. So it was a rather rough colony, and slaves were brought over already in the beginning of the colony. Well, there was a little town up in what we call Harlem. And here we see at the top of the picture a drawing of this little settlement. It was a fishing settlement. You see the boats, and a farming settlement of Dutch. It was called New Harlem. Now, Harlem, spelled in the Dutch way, had two A's because there is a town in Holland called Harlem. In fact, I visited it last summer. Just like New Amsterdam was named after Old Amsterdam back in Holland. And later when the English took over in 1664, well, they simply named it New York after the city of York back in England. Well, there was this little village up there that already had the name Harlem, a couple hundred people maximum, a church, farms, and you can see it was wooded, as was all of Manhattan. Well, Harlem remained a small, rather neglected settlement, like so many of the Dutch and later English settlements scattered over Queens and Staten Island and Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Upper Manhattan. Well, Harlem entered a new phase when, you can see the picture on the left, when Central Park was built. Well, with the creation of Central Park from 96th Street up to 110th and from 5th Avenue to 8th Avenue, right in the heart of Manhattan, 3 new neighborhoods were established. On the right, we see the Upper East Side, which is eventually where all the rich people settled. Still, it has the most expensive zip codes in the United States. The Upper West Side was an area of apartment blocks and more educated people. Further north was Columbia. Well, north of Central Park, a new neighborhood emerged, which was called Harlem. Central Park was built beginning during the Civil War times, gradually expanding up to 110th Street. So following the Civil War, New York really boomed economically, and there were a lot of very wealthy people. Extreme wealthy people built their mansions along Fifth Avenue. But in Harlem, it was an area of, as we can see on the right, beautiful brownstones. Called brownstones because they were made out of brown sandstone brought down from upstate New York and other places. 3 floors, rows. You can see they're almost all identical, meaning it was some speculator who decided to buy an entire block or an entire street in this new neighborhood of Harlem, just north of Central Park, would buy the whole street, mass produce these beautiful brownstones. Now, Harlem was a white neighborhood for upper middle class people following the Civil War. These were not the bank owner. The rich owner of the bank was in the Upper East Side. But his accountants, his business managers, his investment people moved to Harlem. Harlem was where doctors, lawyers, professors, dentists, accountants, these were the kinds of people who settled in Harlem, this new emerging neighborhood. It was an upper middle class neighborhood. Well, these people, like any other group, built their houses of worship. And here we see a view of Lenox Avenue. You can see from the cars that this is a recent picture. This was the magnificent Temple Israel. Probably many people say it was the most beautiful synagogue in New York City, built right on Lenox Avenue. Just up the street was the Harlem Dutch Reformed Church. Episcopal churches, Presbyterian churches lined the Lenox Avenue. Now, Lenox Avenue at the time had a median down the middle with trees and flowers, and everybody would go to church on Sunday, and they'd come out and go to restaurants and stroll up and down the street, showing off their finery. And so it was becoming an upper middle class neighborhood. This, the late 1800s, is called the Golden Age of Harlem Brownstones. And here we see a book, Bricks and Brownstone, the New York row houses. And here we see that it is a type of architecture that is typically New York, typically post-Civil War, upper middle class families. Now, when we look at these brownstones, you can see they're all identical. Same entrance, same front doors, same windows, 3 floors. The first floor you go in, you have to go up a little flight of stairs. This is called the stoop, and it's a Dutch word. And you go in, and that are the public rooms, big sliding doors in the middle. They're long and narrow, but these were the music room, the library, the dining room. The kitchens and the laundry were down in the basement, underneath this stoop with this door going into the basement. And these were where the girls would do the ironing, the cooking, the repair work for clothing. The family had their bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The 3rd floor was the children's room. And so these were one-family homes during the late 1800s and early 1900s, the golden age of brownstones. On the right, you can see that brownstone has become sort of synonymous with row houses, with beautiful homes across the country. There are New York brownstone clubs, brownstone tours, and there are other brownstone enclaves, such as in Brooklyn, which has a magnificent collection of brownstones, all dating from just after the Civil War. I always ask my students, is a war good or bad for business? The answer is, of course, it is excellent. Fortunes are made. And that is why Harlem flourished in the decades after the Civil War because so many fortunes were made. Factories had managers, they had accountants, they had lawyers, and these were the people who settled in Harlem. So Harlem was white, upper middle class. Well, all good things come to an end. By 1893, the golden age of the post-Civil War fortunes was beginning to tarnish. There was the economic panic of 1893, which lasted for over a decade. Massive unemployment. People lost their jobs. The people who had invested a fortune in Harlem brownstones, buying entire streets, filling them with mass-produced brownstones, suddenly, in the late 1890s, they found themselves sitting with a brand new street filled with brownstones, nobody with the money to invest. What were they supposed to do? Well, they decided that certain streets, these are the real estate owners and businessmen, decided that there was an untapped market. There were large groups of African Americans living in New York City, down in what is today the Hell's Kitchen area, which was the big African American neighborhood where today Lincoln Center is, and going over to the Hudson River. Well, there were African Americans who had money. They too had prospered in the decades after the Civil War. There were African American lawyers, doctors, businessmen, bank owners, and they were eager to get out of the rough neighborhood called Hell's Kitchen. It was not called Heaven's Kitchen, it was Hell's Kitchen, where new immigrants went, which was dangerous, where bodies would be found in the morning. So the real estate owners in Harlem decided to open up certain streets for African American residences. In fact, there were newspaper articles in the New York Times announcing that such and such a street would henceforth be for Black people only. All white people had until the end of the month to get out and to move to a street which would be designated a white street. So beginning up in the 140 streets over around 8th Avenue, they started emptying buildings of the few white residents who were there and selling them or renting them to African Americans who had money from New York City. Well, this new emerging, very nice neighborhood, these are brand new homes. I mean, latest in doors and kitchen equipment, and paint was hardly even dry in many of them. Well, this not only attracted upper class African Americans from New York City, Long Island, even New Jersey, but immigrants coming or migrants coming from cities like Boston, Philadelphia. They heard word about this beautiful new neighborhood, definitely not a slum, where African Americans were welcomed, even encouraged to move. Word spread to the people of the Caribbean islands. And we know places like Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico were constantly being ravaged by hurricanes, revolutions in many countries. And so there were many Hispanics from the islands, Black residents of Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, who fled the chaos of these islands. These were doctors, lawyers, educated people who decided to come to this new emerging Black neighborhood. And also beginning in the late 1800s and especially in the early 1900s, what we call the Great Migration. Millions of young African Americans from the Deep South migrated north. And this is where not only Harlem emerged, but the African American neighborhoods of Boston, of Philadelphia, of Chicago, Detroit, because the jobs were available in the north. Now, most of these people who were migrating were youngsters. ages of 14, 15, up to 25, single, no family ties. They flooded into New York and they started taking over new sections of Harlem. Well, of course, as the African American and Black population of Harlem expanded, taking over more and more streets, of course, the white people would end up migrating. They would end up leaving. Well, the rise of an African American Harlem in the late 1800s and early 1900s was marked by the building of African American churches. Here we see two churches in Harlem, once again in the 140s. This is not down at 125th Street or 116th Street yet, but the African population was expanding. Well, the well-to-do New York African Americans brought their churches with them. And here on the left, we see the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Mother Church. And on the right, we see Abyssinian Baptist Church. These were two churches founded in the very early 1800s. So by the time they were moving to Harlem, they were over 100 years old. Well, they fled Hell's Kitchen. Pastors sometimes even ordered the people. They were moving. And they went up to Harlem and they raised funds to build these monumental churches, which are still there until today. I mean, look at the stained glass windows. These were imported from Europe. The woodwork in the pews was polished and highly decorated. Organs were brought over from Germany and France. So these were educated, upper-class African Americans who brought their churches with them, and they still exist in Harlem today. Really monumental pieces of architecture. So these were the very first people who started moving to Harlem. Well, other religious leaders started moving to Harlem, and gradually we see on the left a preacher called Sweet Daddy Grace, who was an immigrant from Cape Verde Islands in the Atlantic. His name was Grace in Portuguese. And he migrated to New York, founded his own church, starting off among the lower class immigrants, little storefront chapel, began preaching on the streets. And this is the United House of Prayer for All People as it looks today, one of the more monumental churches. So new religious leaders were coming. On the right, we see the former Temple Israel. As the Jews fled Harlem, well, they sold their churches to African Americans. They sold their synagogues to African Americans. This is today the Mount Olivet Baptist Church. It's interesting, when you go to this church, former synagogue, one of the conditions was that when the Jews sold it to the African Americans, they wanted it to remain in its form as a synagogue. Well, the stained glass windows have stars of David. You go into the inside, you see the Hebrew writing, you see the Jewish symbols all over, and it still retains its memory as a synagogue. Now, these buildings have remained, like Temple Israel. When it became a Black neighborhood, it simply took over the churches and synagogues. When Sweet Daddy Grace got enough money and enough followers, he built his big church, both of these which are still functioning until today. Now, they have suffered a population drop as more and more African Americans leave Harlem and move to Jamaica and Brooklyn and other places. The African American population is declining, and it's a real question of what is going to happen to these buildings. But neither Temple Israel nor Sweet Daddy Grace's church are going to be demolished. They have become permanent fixtures of Harlem. Another person who migrated to Harlem and left his mark was Marcus Garvey. And here on the left, we see the church. It was a Catholic church where he gave one of his very first speeches in New York in 1916, migrating from his homeland, Jamaica. Brought with him the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the African Communities League. Once again, one of the great figures who came to Harlem and contributed to its becoming an African American city within a city. W.E.B. DuBois from Boston, Harvard graduate, founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909, one of the very first civil rights organizations, demanding the ending of lynching, challenging all of the Southern racist laws, segregation laws, laws of discrimination, transferred his organization to Harlem. Once again, one of the upper class African Americans coming from other cities. Adam Clayton Powell, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, another leader in the civil rights movement, challenged Bloomstein's policy, the largest department store on 125th Street, demanded that they hire African Americans, even though it was Jewish owned and Mr. Bloomstein had no love for Black people. Still, in the end, he realized that as far as business was concerned, the African Americans were taking over Harlem, so he better adjust to it. And to his credit, he hosted at his department store the very first known Black Santa Claus one Christmas. And so he found that, in spite of his own racial prejudices, African Americans were good for business. So Harlem was really expanding. This is 125th Street. This is not what, but 140th Street, where you saw the first churches and the first African Americans, but the African American population was expanding down to 125th Street and then pushing down towards 116th Street. Well, during the 1920s, there were so many well-to-do African Americans in Harlem. Artists were flooding in from the South, bringing jazz, bringing soul food from the South, bringing culture and music. And Harlem became the center of African American culture. We call this the Harlem Renaissance. Great writers like Alan Locke, and we see other people bringing their culture and celebrating their culture. African music from the Caribbean islands, from South America, from the rural South was flooding into Harlem. Now, we called it the Roaring Twenties in general. Well, this was once again the result of World War I, when jobs were going a-baying. Any young African American from anywhere in the country or even abroad could come to New York during the war, and during the Roaring Twenties could get a job. He was spending his money on himself. Jazz bars, clubs, Negro spirituals in churches. This was a flowering of African American culture during the famous 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. The Apollo Theater became a mecca for African American music. Here we see the advertisements for Duke Ellington and his band. Thousands of people would go every weekend to the famous Apollo Theater, which began as an all-white theater back in the days when Harlem was all white, then became a major center for African American culture. In fact, until today, you can see the two guys walking down there, say last show. Well, Apollo was famous because every Wednesday night there was a sign there that said amateur night, meaning anybody could come in, get up on the stage, sing, dance, do whatever you did. If you were good, you might get a contract. If you were lousy, you were thrown out the door. But many people began their careers at the famous Apollo Theater. On the right, we see the Cotton Club. I love that sign on the right where it says dinner, $1.50. Below it are 5 cents. I mean, this was the golden age of the Cotton Club. Now, the Cotton Club featured the best in African American entertainers, musicians, dancers, jugglers, you name it. They would perform at the Cotton Club, and white people went by the thousands to enjoy this flowering of culture which was taking place in Harlem. Well, those were the golden age when Harlem was an African-American neighborhood expanding from 140s, where the first upper class New York African-Americans settled, going down to 125th Street, and then gradually with the mass migration from the rural South, pushing the whole way down to 110th Street. A huge African-American neighborhood, very often referred to as the African-American Mecca. Mecca in the sense of the holy city of the Muslims, where every Muslim is required, if at all possible, to make a pilgrimage to the sacred city of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, Harlem was a Mecca. It was a place where African Americans just had to see this flowering of African American culture. Educated people, sophisticated people, along with the usual lower class people who flocked into this neighborhood. Well, World War II once again increased the African American population. More jobs were available. Well, by the 1980s and 90s, New York City was again a growing city. New immigrants were coming in. And as anybody will tell you, from John Jacob Astor to Donald Trump, it's location, location, location in New York. New York real estate speculators are always on the lookout for a rundown neighborhood that they can buy, kick out the population, and transform it into a brand new area with towering, gleaming skyscrapers and make a fortune. Well, by the 1980s and 90s, the real estate developers and speculators had discovered Harlem. Harlem, under the African Americans, yes, they had built churches, but they had mainly taken over churches and synagogues and businesses and brownstones that the white people had built back following the Civil War. Well, a lot of the brownstones had been chopped up into 2 and 3 and even 4 apartments or rooming houses. A lot of the churches and synagogues were still flourishing, but some of them were getting rather run down. Harlem was known as an area for drug dealers, and like they say, the first one fired is the last one hired. So whenever there'd be an economic crisis, there would be massive unemployment in Harlem. And so the real estate speculators started investing in rundown brownstones, very often hiring a front person, a black person, to go in and to buy a brownstone from another person, with the plan to either tear it down and build a nice big apartment building, as we see on the right, or to kick out the people, restore the brownstone, and sell it as once again, a one-family home. So the wrecking ball, the housing developers, the urban renewal people discovered Harlem beginning in the 1980s and 90s. And here on the left, we see just a handwritten sign, Harlem not for sale, fight back. And there was resistance against these real estate speculators, but nobody holds them back, as the great real estate speculators of New York will tell you. And so Harlem began its transformation once again from an all-Black neighborhood to its current state as a predominantly white neighborhood. Well, one part of New York that is important are, of course, the sidewalks. People are walkers in New York. The streets are thronged. Well, Harlem had its huge crop of street corner preachers. Here on the left, we see Black Hebrews. These are people largely of African Americans who claim to be the lost tribes of Israel and have started their own religious movement called the Black Hebrews. Well, they are ever present on the streets of Harlem. And so there is a movement now to remember the street life of Harlem. The buildings might be going, brownstones will be emptying out, entire blocks along 125th Street and 116th Street are being demolished, the African-American little businesses are being kicked out, and giant box stores are moving in. But part of remembering Harlem is remembering the streets of Harlem and the life that Harlem once had. The buildings might go, but the sidewalks remain. One example is, you see there's me on the right, and that's in front of the Apollo Theater, where they have taken over the sidewalk in front and they have put in all of these plaques celebrating all of the different African-American singers and dancers and performers who made a career at the Apollo. They still have their Wednesday night amateur night where anybody can go in and try to become famous. But this is an example of preserving the streets, which are emerging as a major battleground of African Americans trying to preserve the history of African American Harlem. Here we see an example of a church that 1990, when I was there, took this picture. This was called the Downtown Baptist Church along Lenox Avenue. Well, when I went back in just about a year ago to see the church, I found a hole in the ground. And in fact, there was this person who I don't know who she is, but Kayla Tello, who recorded the demolition of this church. Now you can see it was not a magnificent piece of architecture. It was basically just a personal home with a little front porch added on and turned into a place that looked like a church. But she chronicled the loss of this little unimportant chapel. Who knows what happened to the pastor or the congregation, but it was a way of remembering a chapter in Harlem history that most people are not concerned about. And if you go to the address on the screen, hopefully it is still up there, but you can see her recording of this loss of a piece of Harlem history. The Commandment keepers who rented they bought this beautiful building on the right, which is over at 123rd Street near Mount Morris Park. The Commandment keepers, another group of Black Hebrews, had their synagogue, their yeshiva, their institutions inside this building. On the right, you can see they had the Star of the David on the door. And when I went back the last time in just a year ago, I saw that the whole front door was boarded up. The Star of David was gone, and it was returning to its origins as an all-white neighborhood building, an apartment building. So here again, this is another chapter of African American history that is lost and is largely forgotten. Here we see three stages of a church. I went back several times. This is called Christ Temple House of Prayer Deliverance Church. This is also on Lenox Avenue. The first time I went, I saw the picture on the left, and you can see it was a rather ordinary apartment building or one-family house at one time that they had turned into a temple. Well, in the middle, we see a sort of a more decorated version where they had spruced it up a little bit. But what's interesting is on the right, you can see that the building was torn down, making way for urban development. Well, the last time I went, just a couple months ago, this is what I saw. A giant apartment building going up beside it in the empty lot. Well, the apartment building had every intention of taking over the church and demolishing this poor little building, but evidently the church resisted. And here you see the new facade, and that's all it is. It is a facade with the tower and the cross that is being attached to the building itself. Here again, this is one little unimportant, nondescript church that is doing everything it can to survive. But as I so often have noticed, when next time I go walking around Harlem with a group of students or friends, I could go up there and find that even that little building is gone. One of the reasons that so many African Americans are leaving is the simple fact that taxes are going through the ceiling. Now, of course, most churches, if they have tax-exempt status, it doesn't bother them. But you can imagine a pastor sees his flock being priced out of the apartment buildings, losing their jobs and businesses, leaving Harlem, a dwindling population. Value of that little lot probably is going through the ceiling. You can imagine if you look closely at the building that's going up, there are no windows facing the chapel, which means they probably have every intention of eventually grabbing that little lot and expanding the building and increasing their revenue. So another chapter in remembering what Harlem once was. Here again, we see the effects of urban renewal, gentrification, and call it whatever you want. This is the Antioch Church of God in Christ, over right off of Mount Morris Park. Well, the first time I went, I saw this rather rundown building with a little buildings on either side, covered with vines and crosses painted in the windows, but still having a church service. Well, the next time I went, just a couple months ago, this is what I saw. A big apartment building, an office building on the right, another one on the left. It basically being squeezed out. So once again, the church is still there, but the congregation is dwindling. The value of the real estate is going through the ceiling. And so it's perfectly possible the next time I go there, there will be no church on the location. Another example of a church which is still barely there. This is the Progressive Baptist Church over on West 126th Street. As you can see, all the buildings on both sides have been demolished. The church is still there, but it is long closed. The doors were boarded up, the plaster is falling off, even the sign is falling apart, but It is still there. Now, once again, probably the congregation moved elsewhere. The pastor, or very often the pastor's children, inherited the building. Now, a big problem in Harlem is, you can imagine the value of this building, especially since the buildings on both sides have been demolished. This could be a 20-floor mega apartment building on this spot. And so very often the owners, very often the children of the founder of the church, are fighting amongst themselves to see who gets the money. Lawsuits going back and forth. I don't know if that's the case with this church, but I do know there have been many of these little chapels still standing, falling down, but worth millions in real estate, which brings out the worst in the holy pastor's children or wife or ex-wives or even sometimes congregation owners. There's another church that is on its last legs. You can see St. Catherine's Church on the left and the Gospel Temple Church of Christ on the right. Some of them are still going. The one on the right, the Gospel Temple, you can see there was a fire and the upper floors are condemned, but they're still using the basement and as a sort of residual chapel. The sign on the door, I believe, said that the church building was condemned. But here again, you see it is a beautiful row of brownstones. These are rather unusual because they're only 2 windows wide. The traditional Harlem brownstone was 3 windows wide, but long and narrow. I love to walk through Harlem at night because very often you can look in the window that you see here and you can see straight through the entire building out into the trees and the little yard behind the building, because in the middle there were these giant sliding doors which you could open and put in a long dining table and have magnificent entertainment, even dancing in this huge space, because it was open. Basically the living room and the dining room with the kitchen and everything else down in the basement. But here again, you still see the signs testifying to, at one time, these buildings had thriving congregations, very often charismatic preachers, deacons and deaconesses, and engaged in all kinds of good works, rousing worship, which is now, as you can see from the state of the 2 buildings, a thing of the past. But a lot of these little signs, these marquees, still remain testifying to what once was in this building. Another example, the new Pilgrim Baptist Church. When I first visited it, you see that there were 2 churches, one right beside the other, with plastic stained glass windows in the front, and vibrant congregations with the awnings. In the middle, you see the sign, New Pilgrim Baptist Church, a very vibrant congregation. John Davis, Sr., pastor, upper room prayer and praise services on Friday, night prayer service on Wednesday, and Bible study, Sunday morning worship, devotional service, church, school. I mean, an entire list of religious activities which one time took place in these buildings and which now are finished. The picture on the right is what I saw just a couple months ago. The awning is gone. The fake stained glass window is gone. They have been beautifully restored once again as 3 window wide brownstones. One of these can go for over $1 million. So we not only lost the chapel, we not only lost the memory of the pastor. Very often when I Google these, you find almost nothing available, even when you have the pastor's name. An entire chapter of history lost, going back to the way it looked very much as it was back in the late 1800s when it was a one family home of a white doctor or lawyer. Harlem was unique when it was a white neighborhood because, as we've seen from the houses of worship, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Germans, English, Irish, all mixed together in this non-ethnic upper middle class neighborhood. Another building that has since disappeared is the Shiloh Kingdom Deliverance International Ministries, again on Lenox Avenue. Such a major name, International Ministries. This was some charismatic preacher with a vision, and he was going to not only begin in his little adapted 3-window wide brownstone, but it was going to be international ministries. It was going to grow. It was going to flourish. But now you look, the sign is barely there. It is closed, and it is a part of history. Probably the next time I go back, that sign will have fallen off, and the entire memory of this church will be totally lost. Another one which is fascinating was the Gethsemane Revival Holiness Center. This was a sign I took, as you can see from the cars, back in the early 90s. It's interesting, if you look at the sign, you see founder-elect Lady D.B. Stevens, Pastor Patricia Stevens, who I understand is her daughter. This is another chapter of women's religion in Harlem. Baptist and mainstream churches did not permit women to preach. Don't forget, St. Paul said women should be silent in church. But new movements like the Pentecostal and the Revival Holiness churches, Spiritualist churches, as well as Voodoo and Santeria, welcomed women. And so women entered the ministry for the very first time through these minor, sort of marginal denominations. And here we see D.B. Stevens and her daughter, who had their chapel, their church, the sign is still there. On the right, we can see what happened to it. That's when I went back. It is long gone, hole in the ground, and being gobbled up by these towering urban renewal projects, which will gradually take over and eventually destroy the buildings on both sides. But this is a chapter of women's religion in Harlem, African American women who have a fascinating history which is being totally lost and forgotten. Two other women-founded and run churches where the signs are still there. I've never seen much action, but this is the Bethlehem Pentecostal Church, Mount Horeb Holiness Church. Again, two new religious movements, Pentecostals and Holiness movement, which welcomed and even encouraged women to participate and take leading roles. And some of these women were vibrant, very lively preachers. Now, of course, you can see from the Bethlehem Church on the left, the upper floors are boarded up, probably condemned. A lot of these buildings have had water damage, rain damage, and only the ground floor, sometimes even only the basement is still being used, if it is being used at all. A few survivors might linger who remember the church, but all the people who once lived in the adjoining buildings, most of them have left. They've moved to other neighborhoods, other parts of New York, or even out to Long Island. But these were two more chapters in women's history, religious history of Harlem, which once those signs have fallen off, will probably be no longer remembered. Another church is the Spiritualist Church, which is on 145th Street. Interestingly, you see a Spiritualist church, reader, healer, advisor, very often an area for women's religion. Underneath it is the Botanica, where you have a selling of religious items, religious articles. Both of these are long gone. In fact, these photographs which I have are probably the last memory of this whole flourishing of African American religion in the Harlem. On the right is the Masjid Aqsa. This is a mosque which was in an old factory. And you can see this is over on 8th Avenue, which is one area in Harlem that is enjoying a certain revival, mainly because of new immigrants from Africa, sort of moving once again to Harlem, but finding that the Harlem that they wanted, African American Harlem, is gradually disappearing. But they took over a factory building. They were mainly Muslims, I believe, from Senegal. And you can see the flag on the right where they have timbo and restaurants from Senegal where they feature African food, African braiding salons, even African street markets. Sort of one bright light in the decline of African American Harlem. They do have their Africa Day Parade, which commemorates and remembers all the different countries in Africa where they have come from. The name Aqsa is the third most sacred city in Islam, which is Jerusalem. That is the great Jerusalem Mosque. Many people refer to it as the Jerusalem Mosque, which is currently under Israeli occupation, but still it is a major memory of the Muslim period of Jerusalem. Another church where you can see the gradual transition. Remember I mentioned earlier that sometimes I'd see a building and the sign would be there but falling off. Then you go back another time and the sign would be gone. Here we see the Mount Carmel Baptist Church with the decorated windows and the lively purple color. The sign was still there when I went back in the early 90s. A couple months ago I went, the sign was gone. Probably if I'd go back tomorrow, the stained glass windows would be gone, and it would be once again a brownstone as it had been when it was built. Here we see the Holy Cross African Orthodox Cathedral on West 129th. This was the religious movement founded by Marcus Garvey, who wanted to reject all of the white-run churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptists, which were founded in Europe, and he wanted to establish an African church. And so on the left, you can see the church as it was when I first visited it in the early 90s. I even went to church there on a Sunday, thriving but dwindling congregation. When I went back just a couple weeks ago, the signs were gone. You can see that the front area and under the stoop had become sort of a garbage dump. And there were signs on the door saying it was closed. Once again, it could end up going back to the brownstone, which it originally was, or as so often the case, it could simply be torn down and I'd go back and find that it was a hole in the ground with a big 20-floor aluminum and glass skyscraper going up. Another sign which I came across in my walks just recently is shouldn't be there. This is the new Ebenezer Baptist Church on the left, where you see the sign falling down, but yet there is still a congregation there. And on the right was sort of a little memorial that it was a former church, you can see now padlocked. And the sign out front was from inside the church when it was still a church, and it has an inscription from the Bible. And in fact, when I went there, there was a Bible on the stoop in front of it, remembering what was once there. I'm sure if I'd go back and visit the church, I would find that the doors had been restored. It was no longer a church at all, but it had been a beautiful restored brownstone. Now, as these buildings gradually disappear and fade away from history and are forgotten, the streets of Harlem will remain impregnated with African American history. One of the very first people to proclaim Harlem as God's land, the African American Holy Land, was Elder Clayton Martin, commonly known as the Barefoot Prophet. Was a Southern guy who migrated to New York, was so thrilled with this magnificent new city within a city, the African Harlem, which was growing up. He swore that he would never wear shoes again because the streets of Harlem were sacred ground. Here again, evoking God's command to Moses when he approached Mount Sinai, take off your shoes because you are walking on holy ground. Still a tradition among Muslims, taking off your shoes when you walk into the sacred precincts of a mosque. When I was in Ethiopia recently, Ethiopian Christians still maintain that tradition that the church is sacred ground. It should not be sullied with the dog poop and pigeon poop from the streets. And so you leave your shoes outside. Day and night, winter and summer, Elder Clayton Martin walked the streets of New York's Harlem, preaching the sacredness of the ground. Father Divine, another Southern preacher who migrated to New York, declared Harlem as God's land, the new paradise, the promised land. He would gather tens of thousands of people in the streets. He would open up a fire hydrant and perform mass baptisms. And you'd wash the sins being washed away and down into the drain and out into the river as Harlem people were purified. Once again, sanctifying the streets of Harlem. Place names are very important in Harlem. Here we see the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, today formerly 125th Street. Lenox Avenue has been declared Malcolm X Boulevard, I guess it is. These are once again preserving the memory of Harlem, not through the buildings which are disappearing at a rapid pace, but through the street names. Also on the streets is a growing number of monuments to commemorate the African American chapter. Here we see the statue of Reverend Adam Clayton Powell on what is called Africa Square at 125th Street. And here we see him striding forward. Sort of ironic that behind him is the Adam Clayton Powell office building named after him, but an entire block of buildings was torn down, including little churches, African-American businesses. It was sort of a mixed blessing for Harlem to see a brand new building showing the rebirth of Harlem, but it was destroying African-American history. So sort of as penance for destroying a huge chunk of African-American Harlem, they put up the statue in honor of Adam Clayton Powell. On the right, we see a sculpture done by Okanokwa from is an African immigrant who designed this sculpture to show three ladies, probably on a sweltering hot summer day in Harlem, sitting out in front of their building, probably on the stoop. But behind it is another lost chapter. This is over on Fifth Avenue at 120th Street. An entire section of Harlem was torn down, put up by a giant apartment building, but once again destroying a chapter, but yet putting a statue to remember a tiny aspect of that chapter. Another street monument is the Duke Ellington Memorial at 110th Street. You see Central Park behind it. A big housing development, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Towers, big subsidized housing development, once again named in honor of Martin Luther King. So the streets might be gone, the buildings might be gone, the people might even be moving out, but the names on the street will remain. Various street artists have adopted Harlem as their cause. Here we see Lance Estosbrelli, who did a magnificent mural. It is, you can see the picture on the left, it is commemorating a man and a woman and their children. Once again, the names are there, painted on the side of a building. Now, of course, this is outdoor art. How long it will last is anybody's guess. Some have, that you'll see in a minute, are deteriorating already. But here again, this is to preserve the ordinary family, probably a church-going family, married in the church, the children were baptized, children are probably long gone from Harlem, someplace else, but they wanted to remember their history in Harlem, probably going back to migration from someplace else, settling in Harlem, celebrating the Roaring Twenties, the Harlem Renaissance, and then the disappearance of the family. So this is one of the many street artists who have really adopted the streets of Harlem as their cause. Paul Dale, another street artist. This is his Planet Harlem, celebrating the sportsmen, the main individuals who have made Harlem part of African American history. Once again, you can see it's painted. It's painted over a window and railings and everything else. Still standing, and you can see on the left his advertisement for his artwork. But once again, celebrating and preserving the history of Harlem. So the streets are, in a way, have become an open door museum. How much, how long these are going to last, nobody really knows, but they are part of the history of Harlem. And another one, finally, is Louis Del Sarte, and this is called The Spirit of Harlem. Once again, you can see this was commissioned by the bank to, here again, this is not a local bank, but it is a bank that moved into Harlem, just across the street from the Apollo Theater, marking on one hand the gentrification of Harlem, the urban renewal, where big banks were taking over what were formerly very often African-owned stores. Well, they commissioned Louis Del Sarte to paint this mural. What was interesting, the mural got covered over with a new building going up. and there was such an outcry that the mural was restored. But once again, these are outdoor artworks. Who knows how long they're going to last? This is the kind of thing, the building could be torn down or the mural could be destroyed. But here it is again, an attempt to preserve a fascinating chapter in American history, in world history, and especially in African American history. The rise, flowering, and today the ending of a chapter in African American history, which will fade away. As every time I give my walking tours, I see another building which is gone, another little chapel which has disappeared, another big chain store which took over where once there was an African restaurant or an African American hair braiding salon, gradually disappearing. So this brings us to the end of this presentation. It is a bit sad, but hopefully someone out there will be inspired to preserve what we call daily history, the history of ordinary families, little chapels here, what happens to them, because across the country and around the world, with the rapid pace of urban development, change, migration, neighborhoods are being destroyed, new people are moving in. They don't mean to destroy a neighborhood, but this is what happens. Just like every ethnic neighborhood in New York began somewhere, has many, many different chapters. I have tried to preserve a chapter, not of Harlem in its heyday, but Harlem today as it is gradually disappearing. So on that note, I will leave you. Thank you very, very much for joining me on this. And please, if you have any questions, on the very first slide, I did post the Gmail address, which I use for this. So feel free to contact me or watch many of my other YouTube videos. So once again, this is Ron Brown signing off. Glad you could join me and have a wonderful day.